This is your award-winning BCFM. BCFM on 93.2, 24 hours a day.
Well, off to Barcelona then, Martin. Some pretty horrific events there yesterday. Again, it's a hired van, it looks like, driven into a crowd. Apparently the object, as in one of the statements released, is saying that this is an attempt to create a Spanish caliphate.
Well,
the Muslims did control a large part of Spain.
Well, they did. They used to, but it was more in Andalusia in the south. And Barcelona, of course, is the capital of Catalonia, which is about to have a referendum on seceding from Spain.
Finally.
Yes, but so it may be. We know that the NATO intelligence services have been orchestrating terrorist attacks for 30 or 40 years. We don't know yet. We don't know enough about it to say maybe it is what it looks like, just somebody driving a truck. But if you remember what happened in Nice, when the truck was driven, the police had taken away the barriers which would have stopped the truck. Then the truck arrived, crashed into everybody. Or the guy driving it was not known to be a Muslim, but known to be a Muslim, but not known to be at all devout. In fact, he's got a big track record as a petty criminal. And then the CCTV footage was banned from the secret services wanted it all wiped.
Also, the FBI have been following him for months, haven't they, very closely? Whatever the FBI were doing in France, I'm not quite sure.
Well, that's right. Now, we know, Operation Gladio, going back to the 70s, that the NATO intelligence services do and have orchestrated terrorist attacks.
FBI?
Yes. We've got evidence that 95% of people convicted of terrorist offences in the US since 9/11 have been set up by the FBI. In other words, there would have been no plot if they hadn't set it up.
Well, let's go through some of this. Vans. Actually, modern vans, just like modern cars, many of them can actually be controlled from outside, can't they? You can have someone hacking in and influencing someone to steer in a particular direction.
Yep.
Apparently the van driver has been killed now, so of course they won't be able to interrogate him or have a court case about him. This is another aspect of these that really bothers me, is this whole shoot to kill policy of the police. So they're actually making sure that there's no trial.
Well, indeed, and in the attack in Berlin, if you remember, in the Christmas market, the guy was definitely an informant for the intelligence services and had been watched for months. Now, in other words, it's possible that the intelligence services are making these things happen on purpose or letting things happen on purpose, either MyHop, as they call it, or LIHOP. Now, that doesn't mean that it may be that this is not one of those attacks that's been orchestrated and it really is genuine attackers, etc. But the Madrid train bombings back in 2003, there was all sorts of suspicions about that, and of course all of the people ended up dead, so there was never any trial. And we're suspicious about all of these incidents, and suspicious that the state has got some hand in them.
One unnamed eyewitness told the BBC's Frank Gardner that one of the dying attackers was smiling as he was shot.
Well, I mean, these people are either fanatics or patsies or brainwashed, and we just don't know what the truth is.
Well, that's one of the things I'm suggesting. That could just be a lie. It's very easy to go up to Frank Gardner, who is very, very close with all the security services. In fact, accused by Charles Shoebridge of effectively being a press officer for MI5 or MI6. And we know, don't we, during the John Charles de Menezes case, for example, that we were told that Charles de Menezes had vaulted over the 7/7, just after the 7/7 attacks, and vaulted over the barriers at Stockwell Tube Station, where actually it turned out that the guy that had spoken to the press was a plainclothes police officer that had told the press this, when it was just simply not the case. It was a lie. So it's quite feasible that these journalists have been played for fools.
Quite feasible, and we've got to understand the pattern here. We know that Islamist jihadis have been working closely with the intelligence services in the West for decades. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, of which the Manchester bomber was a member and his father was a member, have been working with MI6 and were being trained by SAS to fight Gaddafi less than 3 years ago.
People in northern Spain have been asked to post pictures of cats instead of images of these attacks. Now, that may be perfectly legitimate to post a picture of a cat instead of an image of the attack. But, of course, this is also because social media is quite powerful in spreading evidence that can then be questioned by journalists like you and I and other people around the world that the official story is not actually what we're being told. So the idea of encouraging people not to tweet any or post or email or share on social media pictures of anything to do with the attacks makes it impossible, really, for people to put up a potential alternative version of events.
Well, that's right. And I'm afraid that over the decades, that NATO's involvement in this kind of provocation has been proved many times. Imposimato, the head of the Italian Supreme Court, wrote a book that came out in 2012, which basically accused NATO intelligence service of being behind all the terrorism in Italy, right and left, in the 1970s
There's been a proposal
and 1980s.
today from several people. I noticed some news stories about it too, about the idea of profiling Arab North Africans who hire vans.
Well, what may turn out to be the case is that these people have been watched by the intelligence service for ages, like the guy who carried out the Berlin attack.
I mean, what they're saying is that anybody that hires a van that is of Arab North African descent, maybe there should be special checks made into them.
Well, ultimately, but the purpose of these attacks, if they are being orchestrated from inside the structure, is the step-by-step creation of a police state.
But I mean, that is also, it's a very sneaky way, really, of saying that these people are somehow dangerous terrorists. If you're Arab North African, you're much more likely to be a terrorist, whereas, of course, we know that there are all sorts of other types of terrorists out there, and some of them hide under the cloak of the state and of the so-called legitimate militaries.
Well, that's right. I mean, we simply don't have enough information to make firm judgments about this attack at this moment.
What about this principle of profiling people before they hire a van?
I think we need to have independent police investigation of every incident, and that one of the things that the police need to bear in mind is the involvement of the security services in terrorism, because they've been involved in terrorism for decades.
I mean, wouldn't they just get one of their mates who wasn't North African Arab descent to hire the van for them?
Well, yes, if they were genuine terrorists and they're not just set up patsies who are being made to create a kind of enemy within that we're all supposed to be terrified of.
One thing I haven't heard talked about at all as a motive is that it might be related to the hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and now Syria and Yemen too.
Well, there is a mainstream discourse about that. If you remember, Jeremy Corbyn, for example, after the Manchester attack, said, we've got to accept. And 60 to 70% of public opinion in Britain also accepted
that relates to this attack. It just seems to me.
Well, that's because Spain withdrew from Iraq as soon as after the Madrid bombs. Zapatero won the election because most people blamed Aznar's participation in the Iraq war for the attack. Now, Spain has actually withdrawn from Iraq, so I would suspect, if we're looking for a motive here, the Popular Party government in Madrid is very, very unhappy about this upcoming referendum in Barcelona, which could lead to Catalan independence, which could also create a run on the Spanish banking system, etc. So something like this, which could, they can call a state of emergency. They're already saying that the referendum's illegal. So they could say the national government could call a state of emergency on the back of this, which would make the referendum doable.
But I mean, in these other countries, Martin, whether it's Spain or not, because Spain, of course, is in NATO, the civilian deaths in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, some say Muslim civilians have been the target there.
Well, the point is that many, many people have been killed all over the world. I mean, this stuff goes on day in, day out in Baghdad, and has been going on every day since we invaded in 2003. It's been going on so much that we hardly bother to mention it. But that's what's been going on. And, suddenly when it happens to people that we know, people who've got credit cards, people who go shopping, real people, then we get upset. And, of course, it's morally indefensible. Killing innocent people is morally indefensible, whoever's doing it. Let's be clear. I mean, there's no way that there's moral equivalence between that doesn't solve any problems by doing this. And a lot of these attacks are they're directed at the general population. Vincenzo Vicinguerro, who's a fascist terrorist on the payroll of NATO, who carried out the various bombings and assassinations in Italy in the 70s, said that the whole point was to attack people in general, because they demand that the state does something to protect them. So these deliberate targeting of civilians is part of a Gladio-style strategy. That's what it looks like.
BBC.
My presumption is that this is NATO but we haven't got enough evidence yet.
The BBC on Wednesday, the day before the attack, reported the following: on the streets of Europe, we meet teenage boys trained by Islamic State. Their testimony reveals wide-ranging plans to turn children into killers. It starts off, Mutassim is nervous. The 16-year-old has never flown in a plane before. He's looking around at other passengers waiting at departure gate at Athens airport. He's unsure of himself. As the flight is called, the Syrian boy runs through the few phrases of Spanish he's learned. The authorities may ask him questions, and he's travelling on a fake Spanish passport. It costs more than €3,000. I mean, it's interesting that Spain is mentioned in this article just the day before as a place where these child Syrian terrorists may be heading.
And that may be a clue that we're being fed a line already about what's supposed to have happened here.
Predictive programming, isn't it?
And don't forget the Syrian general staff, the Iranian general staff, the Russian general staff, and the Iraqi general staff, which answers to the democratically elected government of Iraq, are all firmly of the opinion that ISIS has been armed, trained, and directed by NATO. And we know that that from Jordan and Turkey, ISIS has been receiving money and arms and also exporting oil, which has then been used. Bilal Erdogan, the son of President Erdogan, was accused of personally profiting from all of this. This is all out there. I mean, in the Middle East, people think that ISIS equals NATO. But, of course, in Middle England, people don't follow the news. They're too busy watching EastEnders and football.
In the coverage of this attack since yesterday, which has been pretty much wall-to-wall on the world news channels, the BBC and the radio, etc., the interviews with the eyewitnesses haven't really informed us. There's been very little deeper analysis as to the context, and that seems to be, to me, what's missing. Yes, it's an attack. There's a van driving at people. There's a whole wave of innocent civilians having to run out of the way of the van, but that doesn't really teach you anything about what the context of the event is.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't teach you anything about the context of the particular event. And of course, what we do on this show is remind people of the history of the state's manipulation of these events to create. I mean, the bombing of Bologna railway station in 1980 killed 86 people. Nearly 10 times as many as we've just killed yesterday in Barcelona. But that was definitely NATO. And you know what? Nobody's ever been sent to prison for any of it. And therefore the same people, possibly the very same people, are behind what's going on here and what went on there. But we don't know this. We must be careful to be sure that we don't overstep our own standards of evidence.
Okay, if there is a real problem with Syrian terrorists and Islamist terrorists infiltrating Britain, infiltrating all over Europe, surely the best thing to do is just round up all the Muslims and put them in concentration camps and be done with it.
Well, that is one of the things that's being suggested by the radical right. And, of course, then the purpose of these attacks, if they are part of a Gladio-style strategy, is to terrify the population so that the state can then take whatever steps it wants to take to control the population and move on to, what we're going to do next and what we're going to do after that. Don't forget, what happened after the Madrid train bombings was that a large number of younger people and poorer people came out to vote in the election who weren't going to vote anyway, and Zapatero, the socialist candidate, won instead of Aznar, and he immediately withdrew from Iraq. Now, in other words, the Spanish state has been a rather lukewarm participant in the war on terror, so they need to be reminded what terror is so that they can be chivied back into line. That's that's the sort of cui bono question that you need to ask. What's this really about?
What about terrorists taking away our freedoms? That's what apparently is the motive here.
Well, what's going on here is this: if it is what we think it is, the state orchestrates these attacks at second hand, like the Kouachi brothers who left their passports in their getaway car and then got murdered after Charlie Hebdo. All of the evidence points to the state's involvement in those attacks. It takes a while to analyse what's happened. But if the pattern is as in the past, all of these attacks are being orchestrated from inside the structure, and people should be afraid, be very afraid, because it isn't just random nutters. We've actually got a security structure which paid for by our taxes, which doesn't even not even there to prevent these attacks, it's actually there to foment these attacks. And what we really need to see is independent police investigation of what's happened here, and that would include the local police in Barcelona.
Yeah, and one thing does seem to the Barcelona police they do seem to have done is to stop a much bigger attack. It looked as if that they were originally planning a huge vehicle bomb. And
yes, but all the people there have been shot dead. So that's a question that does raise questions. So there's never going to be any interrogation of those people.
Although one arrested man says his brother stole his ID to rent the van. That's Musa Ukabir, who's still being hunted. Now,
what people have got to get
by now have been shot.
What people have got to get their heads round is that those who are participating in the attacks, some of them are genuine terrorists who genuinely have grievances in their own mind. But that doesn't mean that the state isn't manipulating what's going on, because the state in the past has done exactly that.
ISIS has also claimed responsibility for this attack.
Yes, well, but is it through Rita Katz's website? Site, for example? Is that where what's that? How do we know? I mean, when P. O'Neill claimed responsibility for IRA attacks, you knew it was the IRA because they were the only people who used that pseudonym. When ISIS claims things, who the hell are ISIS? How do we know who's claimed what attacks? ISIS is almost a kind of completely confected phenomenon. And as I said to you earlier, I'll just repeat, the Syrian General Staff, the Russian General Staff, the Iranian General Staff, the Iraqi General Staff, don't forget they're our allies, they all think that ISIS is run by NATO. All of them. A
message from the news agency Amak, which certainly, we've got links actually on off of our show page at thisweek.org.uk. ISIS themselves have denied that having, or actually denied stories that have been published by Amak. So there's certainly some doubts about AMAQ news agency. A message said the perpetrators of the attack in Barcelona are Islamic State soldiers and carried out the operation on command of Khalifa of targeting coalition countries. The coalition refers to the US-led force fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria.
Okay, so somebody claims that they've claimed the attack.
Director of Site Intelligence Group said the Amak claim was preceded by celebration from the ISIS community.
Well, Rita Katz is a former Mossad intelligence agent based round the corner from the CIA in Langley, Virginia, and she seems to have inside knowledge of everything ISIS is going to do. Strange that, eh?
Okay, Martin, also the manipulation...
Let's put a link to her website, by all means. Let's people see who she is.
I will do that at thisweek.org.uk. Also, it does make me wonder, looking at this sort of... the way that this has just not really been explained at all properly in the mainstream press about the context of this. We haven't even mentioned Operation Gladio, the strategy of tension in the 1980s.
Well, I have pretty much mentioned it.
Well, yeah, but to explain what it was about, it was really about bouncing populations and politicians and journalists into believing that there was an external threat, where actually it was fascist cells, internal fascist cells, carrying out terrorist attacks.
That's right, and people have got to understand the history. And also, of course, Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister, was on television in France 3 years ago now, and he said he was approached by British officials, said, we are going to run an armed uprising in Syria, do you want to participate? So, in other words, the armed groups in Syria have intimate links with Western intelligence services. Now, these people are supposedly ISIS, supposedly linked to the people fighting in Syria and Iraq. Well, those people have links with Western intelligence services. As I said earlier, I've listed the armed forces in the world who believe that NATO and ISIS are linked phenomenon. Now, that's not because they're not stupid. They've got a war to fight. They can't afford to make mistakes. That's what they think. And Rita Katz, I said Rita Katz would probably be the source of all of this, and it turns out, yes, she is. She is a shill. She's a shill for the Israelis.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, she's basically... what she does is she comes out and tells the journalists all over the world, oh yes, ISIS did this, ISIS did that, I know everything about ISIS, and she knows more about ISIS than ISIS knows about ISIS. Very strange, that, isn't it, considering she's an Israeli intelligence officer? How does she know so much? Well, supposedly an ex-intelligence officer, but still very prominent. And this Amak site, as you pointed out, various people from ISIS said there's nothing to do with us. So you can see this is a hall of mirrors, but people have got to understand the basic truth of the matter is, and it goes back decades, NATO has been involved in all kinds of terrorism, including Islamist terrorism. From the 1980s onward, Operation Cyclone set up Al-Qaeda. as Robin Cook said when he was Foreign Secretary, Al-Qaeda simply means the base, the database, and that database was held in Amman in Jordan by NATO-aligned intelligence officers, and it was a list of all the people that were armed, trained and sent to Afghanistan to topple the regime there. And then they all came back to the Middle East, and some of them came back to Western Europe. But the linkages between these groups and Western intelligence services goes back 30 or 40 years. So people say, well, it can't be true, they're just made crazy, they're just out to get us. Just look at the history. Look, that's the real context of all of these attacks.
Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.